Good afternoon, task force members and members of the public. It is 2 o'clock, and we will now resume with the public hearing. I will turn it to Parliamentarian Johnson, who will then turn to Ms. Belton, so that a roll call vote can be established.
Thank you. Attorney Belton, would you please call the roll and report on the quorum?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. I will go in order and ask that the task force members indicate their presence. Chair Moore.
Present.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown. Senator Stephen Bradford. Dr. Cheryl Grills. Lisa Holder.
Here.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis.
Here.
Jones Sawyer here.
Thank you, Assemblymember Jones Sawyer. Dr. Cheryl Grills.
Here.
Don Tamaki.
Here.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp.
I'm sorry, here.
Senator Stephen Bradford. Vice Chair Dr. Brown. Madam Chair, there are 9 task force members and the number needed for a quorum is 5. There are 7 task force members currently present. A quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. We will now turn to our next agenda item number 16. It's our second panel for the day. I'm in the 4th panel for the hearing. Yes, point of order.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Parliamentarian Johnson, you are recognized.
You're exactly where you are. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Chair Moore, I had asked before the break if I could get my questions in from this morning's panel. Is that still possible?
Yes, you are recognized, Member Grills.
Thank you. Unfortunately, when I lost power, my 8 or 9 pages of notes from this morning's testimony was not being auto-saved. So to the best that my memory is serving me, these are my questions. First, this would be for Professor Hudson and Ms. Wilkerson and any of the panelists. California had over 200 or 100, I'm not sure the exact number, sundown towns. How might they be investigated, since even with subpoena power, many of the practices were not codified, but they are in fact part of the memory and oral history of people with longstanding residence in those communities? The second question was for Professor Parman. Given your statements regarding the length of time to reach equity and the limitations of single strategies like housing, because of the multitude of other policies and practices that might shortchange gains from that approach, might it be important to consider employing something similar to what is used in environmental policy, where they require environmental impact studies to receive adoption of public policies or to examine potential disproportionate impact of existing policies? Third, for Ms. Gorman, you raised in your opening the harm done to your family, including PTSD, which was important for me to hear because we have yet as a task force to consider the historical and ongoing psychological and physiological damage from enslavement and all the post-enslavement maneuvers used to subjugate and control Black life. Might you share ways in which PTSD manifests itself in your family and or community? And then the final question is for Ms. Wilkerson and the other panelists. Next to none of your work would see the light of day in our local and national public education systems. In fact, this country has made a practice of denying the truth and creating a mythical narrative of the history of the United States. And we also see the backlash against any kind of truth and reconciliation in the controversy related to critical race theory and other such acts. So given states' rights and the perceived limited reach of federal authority with respect to education, content, and practice, how can truth be systematically introduced into our local and national education practice? Are there things California can do to lead the way on this front? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Member Grills, for those questions. Now we will move to agenda item 16, witness panel number 4, which will run between now and 3:30 p.m. I would like to remind each witness that their testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. The first person that we will hear from is John A. Powell. Professor Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policy and practice that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics in California and nationwide. And Professor Powell will have 20 minutes to speak. The next expert that we will hear from is Secretary of State Shirley Weber. Secretary of State Weber is California's first Black American Secretary of State. Before her appointment as Secretary of State, Secretary Weber served 4 terms as an assembly member representing California's 79th Assembly District. Secretary Weber is retired from the Department of Africana Studies at California State University at Los Angeles after 40 years as a faculty member and serving several terms as department chair. And last but not least, we will hear from Dawn Bassiano, who will have 10 minutes to speak. Ms. Bassiano is a mother, a grandmother, and the family historian. She is a resident of Sacramento. Her 3rd great-grandfather was enslaved, and his father was his enslaver. And then we will have 30 minutes for the task force to pose any comments or questions to those providing expert and personal testimony for us today on this particular panel. So without further ado, I would like to thank those who are providing expert testimony for this panel today, and then recognize Professor Powell. You may start your expert testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is Professor John Powell. It's great to see some of you and to be a part of this really important process. I want to start by just contextualizing some of my remarks. I'm going to be talking primarily about civic engagement and voting throughout the country with some reference to California. I'm aware that some people might think that civic engagement in general and voting in particular, how is that related to enslavement? Is that a long drift away from the focus of enslavement and reparation? So first I want to just speak to that. So the 13th Amendment, as everyone knows, is what largely ended, not entirely, but largely ended slavery in the United States. There's a provision in there that allows for involuntary servitude if someone's duly convicted of a crime, which amounts to saying those people can still be enslaved. And there's a history of enslavement for people convicted of a crime up until 1945. So even though we think of this as something that happened a long time ago, there's some indication that extreme forms of enslavement happened until 1945, and some may be going on even today under the 13th Amendment. But having said that, 13th Amendment is the primary constitutional provision that changes the breadth of enslavement in the United States. And one of the things that's important in terms of the 13th Amendment for this hearing, how far does the reach of enslavement go, and how far does the reach of ending enslavement go? And what developed very quickly, even before the passing of the 13th Amendment, was the idea of the incidence and badge of slavery. So it wasn't just formal slavery. The country, both in terms of popular discourse and legal discourse, recognized that there were some things that were incidence and badge of enslavement. Now, the exact meaning of those terms have mutated and continue to mutate. And probably one of our best sources in terms of legal discourse is Justice Harlan, who's sometimes called the Great Dissenter. And under Justice Harlan's jurisprudence, it's fairly clear that many of the issues that we're dealing with today, that he was dealing with at the time, from a jury selection, from a public accommodation, from segregation, and including voting, was considered a badge and incidence of slavery. So one could argue, so why are Blacks not oftentimes given public accommodation during Justice Harlan time? And Justice Harlan said that in of itself is a badge and incidence of slavery. So what I want to posit is that many of our voting laws themselves are also a badge and incidence of slavery. So it's not far removed. It's actually just an extension of the way we continue as a country to deny people their citizenship rights, the human rights, and to dismantle the badge and incidence of slavery. So let me go now to the 15th Amendment, which is passed in 1870. And after Congress passed the 13th and 14th Amendment, they found that Blacks still were being greatly intimidated and were not being given the right to vote. And they passed the 15th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote, and basically says someone should not be denied the right to vote based on previous servitude. So the 15th Amendment then is the constitutional amendment that enshrines voting, if you will, to actually remove the badge and incidence of slavery. When we look at voting, we find that, first of all, that passes, even though it was passed in 1870, very little was done on a systematic level to actually make sure that Blacks could vote almost up until the 1960s. So we lost 90, almost 100 years in terms of enforcing the 15th Amendment. Now, that's important because a lot of people will think, well, these things happened a long time ago. Why are we still talking about it? The very scope and purpose of these amendments did not really go into effect until fairly recently. In fact, I would say they didn't start taking real effect until 1965, the passing of the Voting Rights Act. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm talking mainly about what's happening nationally, but I also want to bring California into this. So California, when it became a state, one of the things it put in its constitution, it limited voting only to white males. So again, even though it was a free state, it expressly denied the right to vote to Blacks. And when the 15th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1870, only two free states opposed the amendment and initially did not ratify. One was Oregon and the other was California. So even though California was a free state, it was not a state that was hospitable to Blacks. And that continued. There were a number of things California did. One of the speakers already mentioned that there were a number of sundown towns in California. And so there was not necessarily a sharp division between a slave state and a free state. Some people assume that if you have a free state, you are hospitable to Blacks, and that's not the case. California was not hospitable to Blacks, and especially in the context of voting, as well as other provisions. Now, in fairness to California, that started to change around World War II, and in more recent times, California has been considered a more inclusive state in terms of voting and other provisions. That's not true of the country, though. The country has largely remained hostile to Blacks in terms of recognizing full citizenship and dismantling the badge and incidence of slavery. And I want to talk about some of those. Voting itself is key to being a full member of a democracy. I've written articles on that, and I'd gladly make it available to the commission. But in democracy, you can't be a full citizen, and you can't unless you can participate and vote. That's the primary good. All the other goods, from housing, education, to health, to jobs, flow from that. If that's not present, all those other things are on shaky grounds or denied as well. And that's one of the reasons that there have been so many fights over the issue of voting. So after the passing of the 15th Amendment, voting for Blacks stayed almost close to zero until the 1960s. So Blacks were not participating and were still living under a deep cloud of badge and incidence of slavery. On a personal note, probably like many of you, my family was from the South. They were sharecroppers. They did not participate in the formal economy, and they did not enjoy many of the things that we would have considered as an incidence of being a full citizen. They moved to Detroit in the 1940s as part of the Great Migration, and eventually achieved some of those rights, but not without a great deal of fight. So I want to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I want to talk about that both as a historical event, some of its problems with it today, as interpreted by the court, but also to suggest some of the things the committee might consider. So the Voting Rights of 1965 was radical in many ways. It was designed to implement the 15th Amendment. It was designed to operationalize the 15th Amendment. Now, the states had adopted a number of mechanisms to actually prohibit Blacks from voting, whether it was private and public acts. But the list is too long to even chronicle at this time. But there were things like the grandfather clause. That is, you couldn't vote unless your grandfather voted. Well, if your family had been enslaved, your grandfather didn't vote. Actually, ironically, maybe your grandfather did vote because maybe your grandfather was white. But in most cases, the grandfather didn't vote. So there was the grandfather clause. There was the poll tax. Now think about this. In many parts of the South, it was illegal to educate Blacks. And yet there was the poll tax taxing them. There's also the literacy test, a test given to people before they could vote. Again, if you're not educated, can't read, or don't know your history, you're not going to pass the literacy test. There were white primaries, and the list goes on. And one of the things that the Congress and the court found is that whenever they went after any one of these things, the purveyors would actually just adopt something else. It was like a whack-a-mole. You knock one thing down and something else pops up over here. And they felt they could never get ahead of it, that the states kept passing laws to prevent Blacks from voting, no matter what Congress did. And so that changed in 1965. And one way it changed in 1965 was something called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required certain states, and then later extended to municipalities as well, to not change the law without getting pre-clearance if the law was going to have a negative effect on the outcome of Black voting. I'm going to just restate that again. So the law was, you as a state or municipality can't change your law without getting a pre-clearance from either the Attorney General or a federal court showing that your law will not have a negative effect on Black voting. That the burden was on the state or the municipality that wanted to actually change their law. And so you couldn't change it without getting a pre-clearance. Now, that law was struck down largely by the Supreme Court in 2013 under Shelby County versus Holder. So pre-clearance is no longer the law of the land. And what we see is a plethora of new laws and passed all around the country prohibiting, limiting, suppressing the Black vote. Now, that's just a more direct way of doing it. There's also a number of indirect ways of doing it. And I'll just mention a couple. There's something called gerrymandering, which is to draw districts in such a way that Blacks can vote, but their vote does not count. You do not have essentially one person, one vote. Again, Supreme Court, under a very conservative Supreme Court, has accepted the legality of gerrymandering, which is another way of actually limiting the Black vote. Another is requiring certain types of government ID. Again, just in 2020, there have been over 400 legislations introduced to limit voting, over 400 just in 2020. And this is under the backdrop of every commission that looked at it found that there was no voter fraud. There was no reason for this plethora of new laws being passed, except what's happened is the Supreme Court has weakened the Voting Rights Act and basically said to states, if you want to limit people's right to vote, particularly Blacks and other people of color, we won't stop you. And they have been off to the races doing this across the country. And so we're seeing the hard-won fights over that 100-year period from the passing of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment, try to remove the badge and incidence of slavery. That wall has been removed. We're seeing new efforts. I sort of sometimes only half-jokingly say, we're still fighting the Civil War, and the South is winning. And so I think civic participation is key. And I've only have a few minutes left, and I'll just say, while I talk a lot about voting, we can also look at things like jury duty. We can look at other ways which people participate, both to express their citizenship, but also to protect their communities. And this is one place where California has not done so well. Black participation in juries has been abysmal. And there's one study done, I think at UC Berkeley, which looked at something called peremptory challenges, which is what a prosecutor has, not prosecutor, both parties have, in terms of striking a jury. And in one study, I think over 70% of the juries struck were African American. African Americans were removed from the jury, and less than 1% of whites were removed from a jury. Now, peremptory challenge is something that a lawyer can use in a courtroom without giving any reason. All they have to say is, I don't want that juror. And what's happening in practice is a systematic exclusion of Blacks from juries, largely by prosecutors. And you start off with Blacks being underrepresented in the jury pool, and then those who are in the jury pool also being excluded. The last thing I'll mention, as my time runs out, is going back to voting. Again, is historically, what we've done in the country is that we've associated committing a crime with voting. And so these examples are most extreme in the South, but they're actually prevalent everywhere. And until very recently, it was also very prevalent here. And that is, even after someone has served their time committing a crime, there's some states that do not restore the right to vote. And there are literally millions, with a disproportionate number of them being Black, people who are, again, not able to exercise basic rights as citizens to vote, even after they've served their time. California recently changed that law, I think in 2020, to make it easier for someone to vote after they serve their time. So I'll end by just saying California is trending in the right direction on most things. Jury thing is pretty weak still. It's some of the stuff on felonies. But voting is relatively accessible in California. Blacks vote at about the same rate as whites, a little less, but close to the same rates as whites. But this long tail of trying to roll back the backlash in the country is quite pernicious and has had a negative effect on both the Black community and our very democracy. And I think any serious effort to look at reparation has to look at people's right, not just what happened prior to 1865, but what's happening now, the bads and incidents of slavery that continue to be systematically implemented throughout our society. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Powell, for that thorough presentation. I would like to now turn it to Secretary of State Shirley Weber for her expert testimony. Welcome, Secretary of State, and you may begin your testimony when you're ready. Thank you. Secretary of State Weber had to step out. We can turn to Dawn Bassiano for her personal testimony and then return to Secretary Weber. Dawn Bassiano, if you're ready, you can present your personal testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the work that you guys are doing. I'm hoping that you can save space to interview other families as well and hear their stories. I almost didn't come to testify today. Documenting and reliving my family's trauma is extremely overwhelming, but I'm here. What initially prompted me to document my family was learning that my fourth great grandfather, John Binion, enslaved and in the loosest of context, fathered my third great grandfather, Simon Binion. I've been working on my family's genealogy for 2 decades and have many, many stories to share, but 2 that I want to share with you today I think would resonate. My great-grandmother Evelyn married my great-grandfather Ananias Binion in 1906. In 1928, he was hanged, and my great-grandparents' home was torched, killing their youngest child. No time to grieve nor bury her husband and child, my grandmother fled Georgia and headed to California, landing in Sacramento in 1929. It's important that you know she held the pain of losing her husband and child her entire life. Bottling up her grief made her distant, and her aversion and fear of white America I now understand. She mourned in her own way, but never truly healed. And in 1929, she married Pearlie Monroe in Sacramento, California. Pearlie's grandparents, Nancy and Peter Gooch, were enslaved in California, brought to Coloma in 1849, freed when California entered the Union as a free state in 1850. When Nancy was taken to California, she was forced to leave her only child and son, Andrew, behind in Missouri, sold to the Monroe family. In 1870, Andrew, his wife, and 2 sons, one of which was my great-grandfather Pearlie, made their way to California. Their way paid by Nancy from money she earned growing and selling fruit, mending clothes, and cooking for the local miners. Nancy, her descendants, Pearlie, and my grandmother purchased some 400 acres of land in Coloma, California. Close to 300 acres of that land was seized over the course of 10 years by the state of California under eminent domain proceedings to build a state park. The land wherein Marshall Gold Discovery Park sits was primarily owned by 3 Black land-owning families, one of which is mine, the Gooch Monroes. Just compensation was never given to any of these families, and we were denied the financial security and wealth associated with land ownership. Harmed beyond repair, Shirley spent the rest of his life mourning this loss. I also want to tell you about my maternal fourth great grandmother, Pleasant Brent. Born enslaved in Kentucky in 1845, Pleasant's daughter, Lavinia, born into chattel slavery as well, would fight to right the wrongs perpetuated by those who enslaved Black America. In the late 1800s, she is one of many to petition Congress for compensation for their years of enslavement and for Congress to draft laws to better their condition. Although unsuccessful, this effort was one of the earlier attempts to right the wrongs of slavery and secure reparations. Pleasant, her daughter Lavinia, and grandchildren made their way to California in 1909. Their move was preceded by Pleasant's brother Henry arriving in California in 1870. Henry purchased a significant amount of land in what is now Midtown Sacramento, land encompassing M&N Street, bounded by 24th and 26th. By 1900, he would purchase additional parcels and homes throughout Sacramento. Henry died in 1912, and upon his death, his property, including the land purchases, were auctioned by the state under the pretense that he had no living heirs nor descendants, although his sister, my fourth great grandmother, was alive and well. Pleasant contested the proceedings, but her efforts were futile, and that land and property that were rightfully hers was taken. The stories I have shared are just two of hundreds of thousands. There are too many families here in California and across the United States to count, with stories similar to mine. It's profoundly evident that descendants of chattel slavery, those living through Jim Crow and institutionalized racism, continue to be harmed, denied the same rights, freedoms, financial independence, and wealth of that of white America. This country was built on racist principles, ingrained in its moral fiber, and today complacency has normalized racism, widening the wealth gap between Black and white American families. With the institution of slavery setting the stage, we cannot deny the discriminatory practices that continue, magnifying disparities that directly affect our Black communities. Federal policies that do not correct and are rooted in racial practices continue to preserve the health, employment, housing, educational, and wealth inequities that directly harm Black America.
Okay, Dawn, you can take a moment to yourself and begin to proceed whenever you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I was also asked, what does reparations look like? Making amends. There's so much. And I almost feel guilty for feeling the pain that I feel, but it's real. It resonates with me. This is my family. These are the stories that have been told and retold, and it hurts. And how do you fix that? You know, how do you right a wrong that is so systemic? And I don't know. I think we can start by eliminating the wealth gap, you know, however that looks, what we need to do, direct cash payments, just compensation for land that was stolen, educational resources, capital acquisition, access to wealth. You know, we've been denied this for so long. It's time to make a change. And I think there's enough people that know that we need to push this as far as we can go. And there has to be some repair. There has to be reparations. You know, I don't know where to begin. I'm sorry, I'm getting too emotional. But yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Bassiano, for your moving testimony. I think I can speak on behalf of the task force members and say that we appreciate what you imparted to us and to the members of the public. Now, I would like to turn to Secretary Weber for her expert testimony. Secretary Weber, you may begin with your expert testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Mike.
We can't hear you.
We still can't hear you. Maybe try your volume.
Yeah.
Try your volume.
We still can't hear.
We are trying to work with Dr. Weber and her staff, and hopefully her technical difficulties will be overcome soon.
I'm wondering if in the meantime we should ask questions to the witnesses.
We can do that. I have a question for Ms. Bassiano, and it's a question that if folks have observed, I've asked everyone who has provided personal testimony, what would an ideal reparations package look like for you and families similarly situated as yours?
Specific to my family, I guess. You know, if there's opportunity to return land, do it, or just compensation. But broader, We're looking at laws that have been in place for decades that specifically target the Black community, repealing of those laws. I think direct cash payments should be made as well, but we're looking at an educational piece, ensuring that, if an individual wants to go to college, they can, it'll be paid for, low interest loans, looking at the ability to not only secure wealth, but to keep it, ideally, I don't know, starting with direct cash payments.
Thank you, Ms. Bassiano. So I see that Secretary of State Shirley Weber has joined us. So Secretary of Weber, we are looking forward to hearing your expert testimony, and you may proceed with your testimony when you're ready. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
You can, okay. I'm not sure what happened. I've been on for a long time. Evidently something went wrong. I want to thank you for your patience as we try to do this. And as I said, I appreciate the comments of the sister who spoke before me, and her story is familiar to many of us, and the pain is real. And I think when we all reflect on it, we try not to reflect that often on it because it is so extremely painful. I've been asked to just to generally talk about, some have asked me to talk about my encounter in California and the kinds of things that I think are extremely important and influence where all of us are. Over the years, I've tried to figure out my family. And when I say figure it out, not so much the details of who's in the family and who's not in the family, but sometimes to try to understand some of the issues that exist and the pain that people feel and the limitations that folks have had over the years. I ran upon a reality that concerning, obviously my father was a sharecropper and worked in Hope, Arkansas, and had to leave the South because his life was threatened because he was demanding some sense of equity and fairness in Arkansas. And I've often wondered about his father that I knew as a child, who was always sometimes very mean and very much of a disciplinarian, always trying to, very fearful of white people. And I never could understand that as a kid. I couldn't understand it. Now, obviously, his sons that he had eventually all left Arkansas because of the harshness sometimes of his father that was in relationship to what was happening with the power structure in Arkansas. As a historian for 40 years working at the university, I came upon a number of discussions because I did my work in Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and knew much about the riots of the Red Summers of 1919 and what have you. And oftentimes those summers are focused upon, St. Louis and Chicago and those kinds of places. But seldom does it go as deep as down into Arkansas. And so I had a chance to really look into some things in Arkansas and ran across Elaine, Arkansas, and discovered that in 1919, Elaine, Arkansas had the worst race riot of any state in the nation. It was considered the deadliest race riot in the United States, deadlier than what happened in Oklahoma and all the other places. And it's interesting that has never really been, it's now being researched and looked at, but I had to begin to ask myself what impact probably did the race riots of 1919 have on my grandfather, not far from that in Arkansas. Because in that race riot, not only did the incident occur for that moment, but it went from about a month of people really tracking people down in the fields and the cotton fields and the various other areas and basically murdering them. And hundreds of African Americans were murdered during that time to strike a sense of fear in those who were in Elaine, Arkansas. And many people ran and went various other places. But the word of what happened in Elaine was a chilling effect across Arkansas. My father was born in 1918, the year before that, and he had several brothers and sisters before him. So obviously his father, who had been a sharecropper in Arkansas for many years, and his grandfather, who had been enslaved in Arkansas, Oliver Nash, saw the impact of Elaine, Arkansas, and it created tremendous amount of fear and deference that you just can't rise up, you can't raise those issues, you just can't do those things because the consequences, not only for that person, but for their entire family could be devastating. And they understood the viciousness of Jim Crow. And so when my father, obviously in 1951, decided to challenge what was happening at the way stations. It was very reminiscent of what had happened in Elaine, Arkansas. In Elaine, Arkansas, they were trying to organize the sharecroppers to get better wages for what was happening and fairer weights for themselves at the way station. Because the current system was you could pretty much, if you were a shareholder, if you were a landowner and had people sharecropping for you, you could basically charge them anything you want. You could weigh it and you could basically cheat them out of their wages, which is what often happened. And people knew how hard they worked from year to year and end up with less money every year. And so this was the issue that my father was raising and confronting those whites at the way station. And obviously, everyone talked about the fact that it sent chills throughout Hope, Arkansas, because of the fear that would happen to not only him, but eventually his family and others. It was in that spirit and in that concern that obviously my father fled Arkansas, had to be taken out of Arkansas in the middle of the night, put on in a bed of a wagon, taken to a train station in Texarkana, and then sent to my grandmother, my mother's mother, who had left Arkansas some years before, to California. So my father came here with a tremendous amount of obviously bitterness and anger towards the South in terms of what it had done to him, but more committed and determined to make sure that it did not happen to his children. Consequently, my father never allowed us to say yes, sir, no, sir, ever. And even to this day, it is difficult for me to say yes, sir, no, sir. I never say it. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. My dad said, if yes and no is not good enough, then nothing is good enough. And he refused to allow any of his children to ever say those words. And it's interesting because I wonder if we actually came from the South, particularly my older brothers and sisters who were 11 and 12 years old when they came to California, never had a sense of deference of yes, sir, no, sir, ever. Even to this day, and they're 80 years old, they've never actually said those words because that was a curse to my father to be able to do that, a sense of disrespect to you as a person. So my father had this kind of radical spirit about him. And some people asked if I didn't inherit that, and I'm sure we all did inherit some of that from my father. But it became real clear that he saw California as an opportunity. And so like so many Californians who came here, they came to California because California became the promised land. It was different than the South, and initially they thought it was better. And it was in one sense. It was better to the extent like most African Americans who went to the North. When you study the migration into the North of the country, and you look at the books that you study them in Marcus Garvey's era and what have you, people saw the difference that existed in the North and the South. And mostly what the difference was is that you didn't have to live 24 hours a day under the same area or the same roof as someone white, that you had some flexibility. You could basically do what you wanted when you got off from work in the evening. You didn't have to have massa making you come to his house to serve his children, or him knocking on your door in the middle of the night to come do something for him because one of his children was ill. You didn't have to have that 24-hour oversight as you had when you lived out in the country, that they could come to your house any time of day or night and make demands on you. When you lived in the city, you basically had your own neighborhoods, your own communities, and people were less likely to do that. Now, the police may come knocking on your door at night, but at least you didn't have the idea that the guy that you work for in whatever factory or whatever place you work was going to actually come into your neighborhood, make demands on your time and your space. And so in some sense, African Americans saw this as a sense of at least freedom with regards to their ability to have something in their own community. And as a result, they saw it as a better life. Now, clearly it was a better life, but it wasn't necessarily the same life as those who were white living in those communities. They didn't have the same level of opportunity. They didn't have the same kinds of things that they had. And even though they didn't have to deal with the signs of black and white signs in terms of the de jure racism, we had to deal with de facto. The fact that the structure of the society was of such that it did that. And so in California, de facto segregation and discrimination was as insidious as really de jure. It was sometimes more difficult for people to talk about it, to quantify, but surely it had elements of it that basically disempowered communities, and the way in which our communities were structured took away some of the things that we would normally have had. We talk about the fact that school segregation existed in California. And people thought it didn't initially because they only looked at the fact that they didn't have a sign, that there wasn't a law that said you couldn't. But there were things that were done even down to the Melendez lawsuit that basically happened 8 years before Brown versus Board of Education, that really talked about how Latino children were treated in schools and how African American children were treated in schools. And so what you had was a housing pattern and a gerrymandering of housing patterns that allowed school districts to create for themselves these segregated schools. And so those of us, myself included, who went to schools in California, who went to California schools, found ourselves in segregated schools, living in segregated housing projects. I lived in the Pueblos. The Pueblos had just opened as an opportunity. We lived in the Pueblos, and it was, when you compare it to the fact that we lived in a 2-room shanty in Hope, Arkansas, and then moved to a small place in the Trinity Elementary School area, moving to the Pueblos into the projects where you have a house with 4 bedrooms and you got 8 kids, 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom standard, and some space to breathe, some grass, some areas to run and to play and what have you. It looks like a great place to be because of that. But what it did do, obviously, is totally segregate that Black population away from everyone else. The big red track that ran on the track near Long Beach and 52nd Street basically kept that community encapsulated there. And as a result, growing up in Los Angeles, you had the experience of being in a very closed, not close, but closed community, where your school was all Black. I went to an all Black elementary school. My neighborhood was all Black. There were no one there but Black people. Latinos lived in East LA. We lived in South Central LA, very south, as well as in Watts. And so as a result, those communities, those neighborhoods could be easily isolated with limited resources and limited opportunity. When I was in elementary school in the 50s, no one could teach in those schools other than Black people. They did not allow Blacks to teach anywhere other than in those particular schools. And so for me as a kid growing up, I saw nothing but, I saw Black teachers, I saw Black administrators. Well, I didn't see Black administrators. The principals were still all white. But I saw all of the folks that are in my community. It was a closed community that was basically all white in terms of teachers, students in the lower grades. When you got to middle school, you saw a couple of more individuals who were white. And by the time you got to high school, you saw a balance somewhat of Black and white teachers that were there. But the housing patterns were clear. That was clear in terms of where people lived. And the impact, of course, is that you end up having these communities that are basically all Black. Eventually, if you move out of those communities, you will find yourselves in a community that is integrated for a minute, and then it becomes all Black. Because when we moved out of the projects and moved over to 45th Street and between Broadway and Grand, there was probably 3 white people on the block, and probably before we knew it, there was everybody on the block was Black. That they had all their children, their grandchildren had moved them out. And as a result, we end up basically with those things, the reality. California has covenants on many of their deeds that didn't allow you to sell them to African Americans. And those covenants now still exist, but they are you can no longer enforce them. And so what happens is that when you have this segregation, as in my school, you end up with a school that you can control the curriculum, you can control what people become, you can basically decide that the school has a large technical education program, very small programs that still take people to college, very few counselors that take them to college, and basically people become technical individuals who become trained to do things. So the wood shop, metal shop, and those shops were probably the biggest thing, in auto shops were the biggest programs at Manual Arts High School at that time. The smallest programs had to do with college preparation. And it's interesting that college prep only became a major issue and a concern when we had the influx of immigrants from China in the 60s. When the political dynamics changed in China, we basically saw that the school curriculum began to accommodate the interest of the Chinese in higher education, or more importantly, the racism of the school board, that they believed Chinese folks were smarter, even though they hadn't even been tested. And so these were the kinds of realities that you dealt with. When I graduated from Manual Arts High School, they used to have summer and winter classes. And so The summer class had 600 graduates, over 600 graduates. Of the 600 graduates, there were only about 10 of us in the college prep classes, 10 African Americans. The rest of the class was filled with Chinese immigrants, Chinese and Japanese immigrants. And the whole school, in the class of the 600, there were only 5 white people in the whole class. One of their fathers was from a professor at SC, and the rest of them happened to be immigrants who came in and who lived from Russia and other places, who lived in the Black community and sent their children to that school. But pretty much the white flight was common in the community. There were basically schools that, like I said, that were all Black, and with very little accommodation for others that were there. And only at some point, it was interesting to me that when our communities, basically, people would, we be there for a minute, we see the flight, we see people leaving. And the institutions that could not fly away, who could not get away, figured out ways to limit the impact of Black people. And I think of my, I talk about it not because I'm from UCLA, but I think about SC, and SC being trapped in the Black community at that time. It had built its institution there. It had meetings about moving SC out of South Central LA, but that was entirely too expensive because they had built some major buildings and facilities there. And so what happened, of course, as a result of community planning, you increase your visibility on the south side with the parks and the exposition park and so forth and so on. So you pretty much block people's ability to come in from there. You build some houses on the west side that were student housing, low income, some other housing over there that's new. You take the south side and you put some kind of marketplace down there that buffers SC. And the only other thing is right at the freeway, you put a hotel and you put the freeway right there. So the SC then becomes completely surrounded by other levels of development that really are not the same level of development that happens in the rest of the community in South Central LA. And so we saw this regularly, as a way to say that, this community may change, but there's certain things that will remain the same. When we talk about the voting population in Los Angeles, in terms of how people were voted and divided, we continue to recognize the fact, as the prior speaker did, that there were a number of things that limited voting. And we, those of us who are in the assembly, as Mr. Bradford and Mr. Jones Sawyer here, have spent the last probably 8 years making sure that we change some of the dynamics of the process of voting, because even though California was much more liberal in its voting, it did very little to inform people about it. When I ran for the assembly, I had people who didn't know that if you were an ex-felon, you could vote in California. They thought an ex-felon was just like somebody in Mississippi and Florida and other places. You could not vote. In California, they could. Even those in Sacramento who were, as I ran across many of the lobbyists and the lawyers, many of them did not know that you could vote as an ex-felon in California. It really shocked me when I presented a bill that made it required that they basically give information to folks who had finished their term that they had the right to vote. And of course, many of our prisons and individuals who didn't want to do it said it was too difficult to basically do that, and it was too expensive to simply say to a person who was leaving prison, you can now vote. They said it would require millions and millions of dollars to change all of their materials just to put this one line in that says you can now vote. So there was tremendous amount of resistance to doing that, even though that had been California law. We just removed the last piece, which is about the ex-felons, that those who are basically on parole can now vote in California. And we had that for many, many years, those that could not. And so this is a new thing that has happened. And in our office, we sent, I think, of 40 or 50,000 letters to people on parole who've been on parole for years, say you can now vote. Many of them had no idea that as a result of Prop 17, that they could vote. We sent that out. Some of them are ecstatic, finally got their ballots and now are ready to vote. And we see, of course, that what has happened as a result of that is that this whole interest in voting among those who are in California and other places, we see, as pointed out, the number of bills that are now coming forward that are really working to keep people from voting in other states. Now, those bills don't come forward in California because California is a large Democratic population in its assembly and its Senate. However, right now, there is a proposition to be placed on the ballot to now talk about ID voting and requiring people to have an ID in order to be able to vote. And we know that that's one of the new terms that's being used. It's a Jim Crow law, pretty much like literacy test and everything else, that will limit the number of persons who even attempt to register to vote. And clearly it will limit those who show up at the polls to vote if they have to have certain levels of ID that some of them may or may not have, particularly those who are older and who don't have birth certificates, who don't have those things, but have other forms of identification that would allow them to be able to participate in the process. So we are constantly dealing with the fact that this whole issue of voting opportunity, California's redlining of things, has been a part of California's legacy, despite the fact that we have always kind of prided ourselves in being a little bit further along than others. If any of you have not, you should get a chance to see the movie, The Bankers, because it's a true story about how these gentlemen, two men, owned about a third of all of Los Angeles downtown, and how they lost that property through some manipulations and things that happened in courts and some things that were in Texas, and it's called The Bankers. And it was interesting to me when I looked at the movie, because when I looked at the movie, I recognized the two men who had actually been at the end of the movie that had actually been the bankers. They were men that I saw regularly in the Southwest Wave, the black newspaper in Los Angeles when I was a kid. And these were men in the 60s who actually owned a significant number of pieces of property in downtown LA, and they're called the bankers. But it also talks about all of the covenants and the things that occurred that prevented Black people from owning property, not only downtown, but owning property in the west portion of Los Angeles, what they now call the jungle and all those places. All those things were restricted from being used for their ownership. And the only way they could get it was to buy it through someone white, which made them vulnerable to be cheated by the man's wife when he died, in terms of because they couldn't write the documents, they couldn't create the laws that, or the documents that would give them the opportunity. So when we began to look at this, I mean, those of us who lived in Los Angeles, we always think of ourselves as being much more fortunate, and we were, than maybe some folks in the South somewhat. But the reality is the impact of the segregation, the impact of de facto laws, the fact that in fact there was ongoing discrimination. The fact that I went to UCLA in the 60s before, you know, we looked up and there was 30-some thousand students at UCLA and only 300 Black students, and all of them, they were either and that included undergraduate, graduate, and graduate. I knew only probably the whole time I was at UCLA, 3 Black professors in the whole, and that was through 3 degrees, 3 professors that were Black at UCLA. You know, you see this, and it's slow evolution, the slow churn, and we see some more faces coming, but we see now a decline in the number of persons who are at those institutions. It is clearly a continuing struggle in California, I think, to live up to what it perceives itself to be as this wonderful dream that has equal opportunity and access for all. This commission has an opportunity to address those issues, hopefully to provide some permanent solutions so that we don't find ourselves in another 50 years from now having a conversation about reparations. Thank you so very much for inviting me to be with you.
Thank you, Secretary Weber, for providing that excellent expert testimony. It is 3 o'clock, or 3:02 to be exact, so we have 28 minutes left on this agenda item. So now I'd like to turn to task force members in the event that they would like to pose questions and comments to those providing expert and personal testimony. Again, the Blue Jeans technology does not allow me to see everyone on the screen. So in the event that you would like to ask a question, feel free to speak up or use the backstage chat and I will recognize you.
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
With all the testimony that I've heard this day, I don't see how any person of conscience, character, and civility could not understand that the facts have been given. Now, all we need to do is determine what are we going to do about it. What kind of campaign are we going to wage collectively?
Vice Chair Brown, I can, you went out on my end. I can't hear you.
I think Senator Bradford has his hand up.
Okay, Senator Bradford, you are recognized, and we can go back to Vice Chair Brown in the event that he wanted to continue. Go ahead, Member Bradford.
Thank you. I just want to thank all the presenters that just presented, but especially Dr. Shirley Weber, my former colleague, and Mr. Jones-Sawyer's former colleague in the legislature, and my former college professor. The question that has been asked of us most, Dr. Weber, I guess this morning is, what do we, or of some of the presenters, what do we ask them their feelings on what reparations looks like? As the author of this bill, can we hear from you? How would you surmise what reparations should look like here in this in California? If that's an appropriate question.
Yes, thanks for that question. I remember once when someone asked Thurgood Marshall, we were in a meeting together, what did freedom look like? And he said basically that when the poorest and the least resourced person of African descent has the same chance and opportunity as the one with the most, then we will have achieved a sense of freedom and equity in this country. And so, when I think about reparations, clearly I think of the sister's family who's lost so much, as so many of us have, the opportunities that can't be quantified, that you can't quantify my father's lack of education and the negative experience that he had and just trying to survive for himself and his family. You can't quantify that. You have to begin to say, okay, what do we do in terms of opening up this particular society in a way that really makes an effort to create the opportunities for those who are here, but also for the next generation to come, that it should not be something that you can't buy it with $20,000, as somebody asked me about once before. You can't, because that in itself is not even, you can't even, as you begin to analyze how much it would cost, it becomes those things. So we have to look at every institution that we've had, whether it's home ownership and finances, and begin to ask, when will we reach equity and parity, and how do we accelerate that experience for so many? And some are looking at that. And one of the things I'm pleased is that some of the nonprofit groups, one here in San Diego, one of the foundations is actually creating an opportunity, and they've raised, I don't know how much money, to really start talking about helping Black people buy houses in San Diego, to motivate them to do that. That becomes important because we know that is the wealth of most of our families, that most of our families have any resources at all because they bought a house and were able to keep that house. And now we're in a position where, where most folks can't afford it. And so we're limiting the ability of wealth that's there. Education should be available to every African American, regardless of their background in terms of the resources they have. University of California should be free to every Black person in California, period. We can talk about all the other things that happen, and other people might say, what about us? Well, I understand that, and we can talk about that too. But we should make it available to every one of our kids who wants to go to college and who can qualify, and most of them can, because we know that the qualifications at the University of California have changed so dramatically. When others don't meet those qualifications, we now don't require the SAT, we don't require this, we don't require all those things that we thought was the holy grail, and we would never give up. We've given up all of that stuff and we have not lost the quality, nor the expertise, nor the stature of the University of California. I mean, we create these things without, and as soon as the circumstances change, we give them up, we drop them and run on to something else. So, I think you have to do those kinds of things that are bold. Every Black child in California that's born should basically be going to preschool, because they have to catch up for themselves and their mother who didn't go, period. They've got to be I had to be a different generation than my father. Father went to as far as the 5th grade. We could not say, Shirley, therefore, if you get to the 7th, that's a good thing. No, I had to catch up with the white folks that he was competing with, that he knew he had to live with. And so I had to do more than that. And I think that's what we have to be unapologetic about it. At least I am, that we have generations and generations of folks who have sacrificed, who've given so much. And we need to look at every indicator that we think is important in this country. So that when it gets to a point where, as I used to tell folks in schools, when we were talking about education and Shirley, when will we reach it? I said, when I can look at a school and see the test scores and not know who's in the classroom and who's at that school, then I know we okay. Because as long as I can look at the schools in LA and say, okay, this is black and brown, black and brown, black and brown, black and brown, I have a problem. Okay, I have a problem without even looking at the addresses, because that says to me that we have a system that is institutionally denying people an opportunity and is structured that way to do that. So when we get to the point where we don't know who lives in the neighborhood because all those wonderful houses and places are there, when we look at these companies that are being developed and we see the wealth that's there, and we don't know whether this millionaire, this billionaire is black or white or whatever, we will then have arrived. Then we can begin to start talking about how we have been fair and honest with those and giving them a platform for development and growth. So it's comprehensive, and it's not something that will happen in 1 year. I'm hopeful that this commission will decide that there needs to be a statewide ongoing presence about reparations and legislation that goes in, and assessment and evaluation to get us to a place where we need to be, because it will not be, this 400-year challenge is not going to be solved in 400 days. It's going to take much more than that, and a commitment from the state of California, the 5th largest economy in the world, to make it happen.
And I think it plays into the nexus of also ethnic studies, which you two authored that bill, because we heard a lot of folks this morning and yesterday say, oh, I didn't know the history, because it hasn't been taught. So I want to thank you for ethnic studies as well.
Ethnic studies is critical. The brother who talked about the jury selection, most of you, my colleagues here, were with us at AB 3070 last year, that dealt with the issue of dealing with the removal of people off the jury, peremptory challenges. We did that. That was a hard-fought battle. The good thing is we had some Supreme Court justices fighting with us, but we had a significant battle in the Senate to try to deny us the opportunity to get rid of these peremptory challenges, and to make those challenges have to have some substance to it. People are still trying to, there was a bill this year, once again, to invalidate that bill at AB 3070. Fortunately, my colleagues in the Senate killed it before it got any breath at all. So, I mean, these are battles that we fight in the legislature on behalf of us, and I'm hoping that the public pays attention, because once we obtain something, rest assured, they're coming back to get it. They're coming back to get it, and it's just a matter of time if we're not paying attention.
Thank you. Member Jones Sawyer, you're recognized. Member Jones Sawyer, you are recognized.
Let me get off of mute. It's good to see Secretary Weber here. And I just want to take this opportunity, because I don't know how many times we'll be able to get the three of us together, especially when it comes to public safety. You have the chairs of Senate Public Safety here and the chair of Assembly. You do have two African-American men that are in charge of public safety. As Dr. Weber mentioned earlier, some bills got stopped, and it stopped because people that look like us are there in positions to ensure that our people don't get further harmed. But Dr. Weber, we need to look at probably one of the last remaining plantations on this planet, which is our correctional system and our prison system. And the prison plantation system is still harming thousands and thousands of our people. And so as we move forward, and I know you still have some scars on your back from getting the police use of force bill through. We all, and Steve laughing too, we all got, with SB2 and decertification, we all got scars on our backs from doing what we needed to do to ensure that these laws that were put in place, and plus those things are in the fine print. Because if we have read the fine print that freed us, that said that if they jail us, they can then imprison us as slaves again, we probably would have not had that in there. And so we're working real hard to reverse that after hundreds of years. And so from your perspective, and we're going to have a discussion about this further down the line, but how do you feel we can incorporate some of this in here? Because they're, as you said, they're coming after us. Last year, the law enforcement spent $2 million to make sure I wasn't on this Zoom call right now. So it is important there that we reform the criminal justice system.
Well, welcome to the $1 Million Club. They've done the same to all of us, but let me just simply say that it is no question that the penal system itself and how it has operated in this country is really an embarrassment to this nation. It should be. No one has as large a prison population as California had. We had 180,000 people in prison when I became a member of the Assembly. We're down to the 90s, right? 90,000. We've cut it about in half. And people are upset about that. So therefore, you're going to see more and more efforts to legislate or to create more crimes and more felonies than you have before to basically incarcerate more individuals. We have to begin to make sure that that there is rehabilitation in our penal system. And I've had people in the system tell me that they're not going to do rehabilitation, despite the fact that we've changed their name to rehabilitation. There's no effort to try to that folks to go into prisons to come out better than they went in to deal with it. We also have to deal with our K-12 system. You know, that is the pipeline to prison. You know, the fact that we're struggling so hard to get our kids an education, to teach them to have the kind of necessary skills to basically create an environment for themselves. I mean, that in itself, and then you know, it feeds right into our prison population. We reduced our juvenile population immensely. We have to continue this police reform and keep in mind that those who are opposed to it are going to use every fear tactic in the world. And despite the fact that we have reduced our population in half, we have not seen an increase in crime. You know, those are the things that people talk about as if we're just seeing all kinds of things occurring, and the data doesn't bear that out. And so I'm hoping that those who are fighting this battle know that there will be numerous strategies used in order to keep you from understanding just how insidious this penal system really is, how many are folks that it takes from us, how it keeps people in prison for long periods of time, and then how we've discovered also that it's so corrupt that oftentimes the people who are in it didn't commit the crime. We have created some legislation that says that now finally gives people who have been discovered that they didn't commit a crime. One gentleman was in prison for 17 or 30 years. I can't remember which one. It was two of them. One was 17, one was 30. And when they let you out because they discovered you didn't commit the crime, they don't give you anything. They don't even give you bus fare. You don't have a place to stay. And so we now have a new law that I did that basically makes them have to give them a place to stay and those kinds of things, because they assume that they will sue. And even if they sue, it takes years and years and years to basically get the resources. But there's no apology. And the general attitude is, well, they may not have done that crime, but we know they did something. I mean, that's the attitude after they have kept you in prison for 20 years of your life, all of your career, all of your economic producing life, and you don't even leave with a place to stay, money to buy groceries. Oftentimes they have to stay with their attorneys that got them out. And so we are, you know, I've worked with them in terms of legislation to make sure that they have free access to college, that they basically got health care. They didn't want to give them health care, and that they had an opportunity to have a place to stay. I mean, those kinds of things are fundamental if you're letting them out, but you would think that there would be some mercy or some apology from folks who've incarcerated you unjustly for 10, 20, 30 years, and there really is not. It's amazing what people say. Well, I know they didn't commit that crime now, but I know they did something. So they want to create justice even in the unjust situation that the folks are in. So we have to begin to struggle with that, because that is a major issue that's affecting our community, even as we struggle to get people out who've been through DNA tests and so forth and so on, that the system still believes that they're guilty of something, and sometimes will make it that possible by the denial of opportunities, denial of resources for them to live appropriately, and then to pick them up anytime they feel they can.
Thank you.
If there are any other task force members who would like to pose a question or comment, please do so now. by speaking up or using the backstage chat feature.
Dr.
Question.
How are you?
Sorry, who was speaking?
I just said, Dr. Groves, we can't hear you. I think she's speaking.
Oh,
Yeah.
Member Groves, you are recognized.
Going on. Thank you so much. I have a question for Ms. Bassiano. Your testimony really tore at my heart. And I, as a psychologist, it really piqued my thoughts around this particular question, which is, if reparations included something to promote healing from the pain that you and other families like yours has had to endure, what strategies or resources do you think would be considered helpful and would resonate with you, your family, or families like yours?
I think there definitely needs to be conversations. We need to have an environment where folks can talk and understand, the trauma that they feel. I don't want to equate it to PTSD, but I heard that. I don't know if that's applicable. But there are, resources out there for individuals that have, I guess, a clearly diagnosed mental health issue. And I think that some of the things that we deal with and that trauma that's continued generation after generation falls somewhat into those same categories. And I think resources should be made available. We talk about also reparations. It needs to include healthcare as well. And then healthcare, if mental health services are required or needed, they should be available. And it should be something that's easily accessible and removing that stigma that's attached to it. Because I think people may not understand that, yeah, there is pain that's associated with this, knowing what happened to our families. And it's crazy because, again, I didn't realize how much it affected me until preparing for my testimony. And, I really was not going to do this because it was the weirdest thing, just reliving it, thinking about it, knowing the pain that my great-grandmother went through. It's hard. And so definitely there should be something available to families who are still experiencing that trauma.
Thank you.
I have a question. This is Lisa Holder. I have a question for Dr. Weber. Thank you so much to all the experts and witnesses who spoke today. Very, very insightful and moving commentary. Dr. Weber, I wanted to specifically ask you your thoughts on the notion of intent versus impact and outcomes. For so long, we have tied racism and discrimination to this idea that the perpetrator has to overtly intend to do harm, right? And that's very, very difficult to prove in any setting, especially in the courtroom, because someone has to use the N-word, or so you need a smoking gun to be able to get into the mind of the perpetrator and show intent. And so as a litigator, I try to shift the focus on impact. What has been the impact on the victim? What is the outcome? And I think in a much more sort of macro level, reparations does that, right? And honestly, I've followed your work for so long. I think that's the through line in so much of your legislation, moving away from intent toward outcomes and impact. And the work that we do at EJS as well is very much around dismantling intent, focusing on outcomes and outcomes and impact. So my question for you is around this notion of reparations as really shifting the focus to the outcomes, right? Like the massive wealth gap. We don't really care what the banks intended. You know, when they wouldn't give Black people loans, they created this wealth gap. We care about the outcomes. We care about the fact that it's $1 to $10 between Black wealth and white wealth, right? And so how do we really keep, I think reparations is one important framework to push back on intent and put the focus on impact. How do we keep pushing back and institutionalizing this framework?
Well, I think you do that by constantly, as you point out, looking at the outcomes. You know, because you can frustrate yourself trying to find intent. Every now and then there is some document that says we're going to hold them back and we're not going to give them an opportunity. But then that turns out to be limited to the person who did it 50, 60 years ago, and not necessarily the person who is sitting at the bank right now. But the outcome is the actual impact is very clear, whether you know why you're doing it or not. And the consequences of on a person's life is the same, whether they intended to do this or not. It is being done, and the impact is still leaving you without the resources you need to grow and develop. And it still feeds an institution that continues to do that. So I've never tried to deal with intent because that gets too much into people's mindset, their heart, their this, their that stuff. I can't really even begin to deal with. Because we hear that often, that, well, my grandparent didn't do that, or my grandparent did it, but not me, blah, 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 blah. Yet you're still riding in the car that your grandmother gave you. You're still able to purchase land from resources that somebody gave you years ago. You're still benefiting from the Homestead Acts that brought in hundreds and hundreds of foreigners to take free land in this country. I mean, you're still riding on it. You're still living off of it. And so it becomes, to me, it's irrelevant at some point. We need to look at the intent to make sure that the institution did what it did on a consistent basis, the laws it created, the rules and regulations that it imposed, and all those kinds of things. But in the end, we need to look at the outcome. We need to look at the impact that it had, and how do we change that so that it can continue to have that impact in the future. I mean, I think that is critical much more than anything, because even if we're able to address the initial impact, if we don't change the institutions that produce those kinds of results, we know we will continue to see that. And we will continue to see it in our communities and our lives. So I've never tried to deal too much with the intent, because that gets into people's minds. Did they really intend that, or did they not? Or maybe it was someone else that influenced them to be that way. Who knows what? The end result is that it is still having an impact. And basically, when we look at things that exist in society in other areas, we sometimes look at intent, but we more importantly look at impact. If some company is cheating a whole bunch of people, it is impact. And maybe you weren't there when they did the first thing with Johnson & Johnson and the powder for women. But in the end, we look at the impact that it has had on ovarian cancer in women across this nation. So we do look at impact when it's to our advantage. We have a tendency to want to hide behind intent when we think it is far removed from us.
Thank you for that. I have a quick question for Professor Powell. Well, it's a two-part question, actually. So the first part of my question, you hinted on it in your opening remarks, but I'm curious to hear from your perspective, if you could expand on the connections or the intersections between the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and voting rights and voter disenfranchisement, particularly on the federal level, but also on the state level. And then also, I'm really glad that you mentioned badges and incidents, right? As a lawyer, as someone who enjoyed learning about constitutional law in law school, a lot of the times, you know, we know Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, but we often ignore Section 2, which authorizes Congress to eradicate all badges and incidents of slavery. And so another part of my question to you is, you know, what symbolism is present today that you think are vestiges of slavery, or badges and incidents of slavery that could still have a psychological effect for Black Americans living today? And if you have any solutions related to the eradication of these badges and incidents. Thank you. Powell, you are on mute. And your video, yeah. Are you speaking, Mr. Powell?
I can see his frame. He's not present.
Yeah, I think he stepped away.
Well, at least my questions are on record, and he can get back to me to us on those questions. Do any other task force members have any a last question or so for Ms. Bassiano or Secretary Weber?
Chair Moore, I have a quick question.
Yes,
Thank you. Just first, I want to say thank you to Ms. Bassiano, to Mr. Powell, and to our Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, for the telling your personal stories, but also the expert testimony. This question is for Dr. Weber, and it keeps coming up a bit in our conversations. And I'm asking you because of your advocacy around Prop 16, which was somewhat with regard to timing, kind of simultaneous with AB3121. We are discussing parameters of Prop 209, while not wanting to be confined by those parameters, are still, we'll still have to deal with that as we put forward a proposal. So just based on some of the results of Prop 16 and some of the attitudes around, the proposition, what do you have any advice moving forward as we do our community outreach about how to approach those issues?
Well, one of the things, and thank you very much, Monica, and thank you for being on the commission. One of the things that you should be aware of as a commission, and I'm sure you are, because all of you are very experienced and have been around the block more than once, is that as soon as you begin to talk about redistribution of resources, to the extent that someone doesn't get the cookie that they got last time, you're going to get resistance. And I think you know that. To talk about equal opportunity and equity, to talk about opportunities at the University of California and how to correct that, you're going to have folks saying straight up, I don't want to give up my seat to anybody else. Okay. And so, and even if you said, well, okay, we're going to double the number of seats in the University of California, then somebody's going to say, well, I have some extra kids I want to get in too. I mean, the resistance is going to be there. And so I think it will be important for you, and I'm hoping, as I told folks in the initial phase of this, that these hearings are made public, that there are public discussions, that people can see, hopefully, the damage that was done by specific laws and regulations that they can relate to. I was on a reparations call with a young woman who was talking about how her family got into the Homestead Act, and they were recruited when they were Russians in the 1800s and brought in at the time when they were supposed to be given reparations to Black people. They didn't, and they were brought in and given all acres of land somewhere in the middle U.S. And the only thing they had to do was keep that land for 5 years, build something on it, whether it was put a plant or put a shack or whatever it was, and then the land was deeded to them. They were given citizenship to be brought in. These are white folks from Russia because they want to increase the white population. And they were given free land. She said, and my family did absolutely nothing to earn it. She said, so when people talk about, Black people didn't work hard enough, people didn't try hard enough, and these opportunities were there, she was emphasizing, I'm a living example that my folks didn't work at all for it. She said, and that land has been either kept in the family. People have basically expanded it, used it against the collateral of this, that, or the other. She said one uncle bought land downtown as a result of the land, and they still have this land and the resources in their family. And that resources have fueled her graduation. She's a lawyer, her graduation, and all of her cousins and what have you, to be able to have a base upon which they could go to school. So I think it is important when you begin to go out there with what you're going to do. You need to help people understand that this is not a freebie. This is not a giveaway to a group of people who didn't deserve anything. And when she did her presentation, and this was a white woman who decided she needed to do something to make people understand that this was not just, that there's a challenge that's there, and that those of folks like her actually benefited from the racism of this country and the policies that were developed that gave them free land. She said, and I listened to people talk about how Black people didn't work hard enough. She said, and my people didn't work at all for it. All they had to do was do something small for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, they not only had gotten their citizenship when they brought them in, gave them citizenship, gave them land, told them they had 5 years to do something with the land. And at the end of 5 years, the land was deeded to them, period. One of the Homestead Acts, deeded to them. And then they could do whatever they want with that land. And her family had done, she had a list of all the different things they had done with this land as a result of the United States recruiting them from Russia to come over here and pay their way over for them to come and to be homesteaders. So there's a lot of effort that, we need to make sure people understand how this country was developed, because we have a tendency to think it was some bootstrap concept, all these people working very hard, sacrificing, doing this, doing that. And they just rolled right in, put fences around some land and claimed it and had 5 years to do something with it, whatever it was, or even if it's just put a fence around it, and they owned it. And as a result, that fueled their economic development in their families. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it's important. You're going to run into that immediately. That's what we ran into. We had a lot of folks talking about affirmative action, a lot of folks talking about equity. But in the end, if that meant my little Johnny didn't get that University of California seat, even though you had 4 generations of University of California in your family and could afford to go anywhere you wanted to go, they were not willing to share that seat with anybody at all. And so therefore they gave us Prop 17.
Madam Chair.
John Powell is back, Vice Chair Brown, and I wanted to, hi, John Powell?
Yes, you're asking a question about the 13th Amendment and Section 2 of the 13th Amendment?
Yes.
So,
yes, so
go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to summarize if you didn't hear, but if you're okay, then you can proceed.
Yeah, why don't you summarize, because I switched to my phone.
Yes. So really quickly, it was a 2-part question. I wanted to hear you expand upon the intersections or connections between voter disenfranchisement and the war on drugs and mass incarceration in California. We can stick to California. And then also I said I was really, I love that you brought up badges and incidents, right, in Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, because oftentimes, and we've seen this through Albert DuVernay's documentary 13th, so we focus on Section 1 a lot, which is the involuntary servitude exception, but we don't always focus on Section 2, which authorizes Congress to eradicate all badges and incidents of slavery. And so I'm curious, you've lectured at law schools all across the country, even my alma mater, Columbia Law School. So I just wanted to hear your expertise around how is Congress underutilizing that power?
So the short answer is yes, but I'll come back to that. In terms of the war on drugs and mass incarceration, a good friend of mine, Michelle Alexander, wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, which I would strongly recommend. And one of the things she documents in there is that at the end of the Civil War, a number of the states start passing a plethora of laws directed at Blacks to actually get through that exception in the 13th Amendment. That exception being that you can enslave people if they're first duly tried and committed for a crime. So the war on drugs was a deliberate effort, and it's not even subtle. Someone talked about de jure and de facto. I think Secretary talked about that. The government made it clear they wanted a war on drugs to actually attack Blacks and they call it hippies. And so the war on, whatever it took. I was talking to my partner recently about the difference between crack and cocaine. So a lot of the effort was a deliberate trying to actually create laws as a way of controlling not crime, but controlling Blacks. The war on drugs was really a war on Blacks. And I've written an article about that, which I'll be happy to share with you. On the second question on the enabling clause of the 13th Amendment, and most people don't realize this, that most provisions of the Constitution do not have enabling clauses. That is, the clause is there. It doesn't say that Congress or anyone has any right to enforce it. That's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment all have enabling clauses. they all say that Congress, not the courts, not the president, Congress should have the power to enforce these laws. And again, I think Congress underutilized that enabling power. So, for example, when Congress made a finding that racism still exists and therefore we need to continue the Voting Rights Act, and then the courts come back and say, well, we made a finding that racism doesn't exist. The court doesn't have that power. The Constitution gave Congress the power to make that determination, which is unusual, not the courts. And I just taught this yesterday at University of California, Berkeley. I said, really, we should have had a constitutional crisis because the courts were overstepping their bounds. This was, the Congress is to be the fact finder as to whether or not there is racism in America, not the courts on this issue. The last thing I'll say is that Congress could do a lot in terms of reparations. Congress could do a lot in terms of affirmative action because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was designed to affect the enslaved blacks. It's race specific, especially the 13th Amendment. But Congress has never pushed it as hard as they could. So you're exactly right. We haven't paid attention to the enabling clauses of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
Thank you so much, Professor Powell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have run over time for our witness panel 4. I would like to thank Professor Powell, Secretary Weber, and Ms. Bassiano.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Vice Chair.
I have a comment for the Secretary of State.
Yes, you're recognized.
Madam Secretary. Madam Secretary.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your excellent leadership and for your pioneering spirit on this measure. I want to say we've had an excellent expose on those past egregious sins. But we have some right now sins against Black folks. Vis-a-vis in the area of housing. These developments in these inner city communities that were developed 50 plus years ago by Black churches have become gentrified. And this is one thing that has contributed to breaking up of the Black watering holes and historic communities. I give you a concrete example. El Bethel Baptist Church, 2 blocks from my church, built 355 units. And that was supposed to have been a means of giving Blacks who were underserved the opportunity to gain housing, seniors. Presently, those 355 units, only 45 Black folks live there. 45. Now, I am not in any way xenophobic or nationalistic, not in my bones. But what has been happening, the Department of Housing and Urban Development and local housing departments have not been fair in making sure that this lottery system does not break a fair opportunity for Black people to stay in the communities where they were. That is a form of that same denial, oppression, and destruction of the Black community. So we need to do something statewide. I know we got 209 and all that stuff, but in this reparation effort, we need to say they need to repair this breach, this injustice. There ought to be fair opportunities for Black people to still have their ethnic enclaves the same as other communities do. But there's been a scheme and a system to destroy that. And we've lost a sense of quality community because of that one area as regards housing. Same thing obtains for Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, named for two iconic Black leaders. But right now, 70% of the residents are people from other communities. Not knocking them, but if they tell us to go over to people, places like Pittsburgh, move out, we ought to say to them, some of you all need to move out too.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown, for that statement. So again, I would like to thank our expert witnesses and those who have given personal testimony today, namely Professor Blackman, Professor Lynn Hudson, Isabel Wickerson, Professor Parman, Ms. Bertha Gorman, and also Secretary Weber, Professor Powell, and Ms. Dawn Bassiano. Thank you very much. Now we have to move to our next agenda item, which is agenda item 18, adoption of findings. And so for the interest of time, I'm asking the DOJ to put on the screen the findings, but I'll also just read them so that we can facilitate this part of the agenda a bit more quicker. So basically, just as an overview for the task force members and members of the public about the particular item, excuse me. So I just wanted to remind members of the task force that the draft findings were included among our meeting materials. And also I would like to remind the task force members that pursuant to the process that we adopted in the July meeting, these findings as adopted today will be circulated to the task force so that members may draft potential conclusions based on these findings. Those conclusions will be compiled by staff and circulated to the task force as a whole in preparation for the next meeting. So in order to facilitate this more quickly, I'm going to proceed by topic area. So there's findings by topic area. And again, I'll read them, but for the benefit of the public and the benefit of task force members, I am kindly asking for the DOJ to put these findings onto the screen. Thank you very, very much for doing so. So now we will get to the first findings by topic. Okay, and then we'll have a discussion about the findings by topic, and then I will entertain a motion by topic related to those findings. Are there any questions or clarifying questions that I can address before we dive right in? Okay, hearing no questions, we'll dive right in, and we'll start with.
I actually have a quick question.
Yes.
Just in terms of procedure, this is a list of, I think, 24 findings. I don't know whether people had an opportunity to go through them, but I was wondering, just to expedite the process, whether people could, if there are items that they have some sort of comment on or objection to, whether they could just state those instead of reading through every item.
That makes sense. So yeah, that makes sense to me. And in the interest of time, I think that makes the most sense. So, does any task force members have a comment, critique as to any of the 24 findings? Okay, at this time, would I would like to entertain any task force member who would like to entertain a motion related to this agenda item. A motion could look like adopting all these findings in full, hearing no objections, or in part. It's just a recommendation or a suggestion.
I have a procedural question, Madam Chair.
Yes, Member Gross, you are recognized.
So for example, on page 109, findings topic racial terror, the KKK is noted along with lynchings and a few other things, but we can revisit these in light of subsequent testimony that is yet to happen. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Because there's some more things that could go under that section, but we've yet to hear testimony in certain categories that would further inform that. Similarly, under the category of California and disenfranchisement. So if we have an opportunity later to amend these, I just wanted to make sure procedurally that I was understanding that correctly.
Yes, that's my understanding as well, that we could amend these. And then also, again, we're also going to draft conclusions based on these findings. And so, like through our drafts of those conclusions, we can make notes as well based on what we heard today. That's another thing that I wanted to bring out there.
Right, because also one other example is under re-enslavement, there were actually policies that re-enslaved Black children. It was the precursor to the child welfare system, and we are still dealing with the consequences of that. So yeah, so there's much more testimony I think that we need to hear to fully flesh some of these categories out.
Yeah, and to be honest, we didn't necessarily receive these until this past week. So honestly, it does take, it's going to need to take more attention.
Madam Chair.
Parliamentarian Johnson, you're recognized.
Thank you. There's one recommendation that I could make is that you adopt these as preliminary findings of fact that will allow you to come back at a later time and amend them with additional findings.
Thank you very much for that suggestion, Parliamentarian Johnson. So again, at this time, would any task force member like to entertain a motion related to this agenda item at this time?
I would like to, this is Member Grills, I would like to entertain a motion to accept these as preliminary findings of fact, subject to change or subject to amendment with additional information in future hearings.
Thank you, Member Grills. That has been moved by Member Grills to adopt these draft findings as preliminary findings of fact, with the notion that we will be able to amend these findings in the event that additional information is gathered. Is there a second on the motion?
I second the motion, Madam Chair.
It has been moved and seconded that we adopt these findings as preliminary findings with the ability to amend the findings as appropriate. Is there any discussion on this matter? Hearing no discussion, I would like to cue Parliamentarian Johnson, who will then cue Ms. Belton, who will take a roll call vote on this motion.
Madam Chair, would you like to restate the motion that they will be voting on?
Yes, Parliamentarian Johnson, the motion will be that we will adopt these draft findings as preliminary findings with the ability to amend the findings as more information is gathered.
Thank you. Attorney Belton, would you please call the roll for the vote?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will go in order, and I ask the task force members to indicate their vote. Chair Moore, your vote, please.
Aye.
Aye. Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Dr. Brown?
Yes. Yes.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown votes yes. Senator Stephen Bradford?
Aye. Aye.
Senator Stephen Bradford votes aye. Dr. Cheryl Grills?
Aye.
Aye. Dr. Cheryl Grills votes aye. Lisa Holder?
Aye.
Lisa Holder votes aye. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer?
Aye.
Aye.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer votes aye. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis?
Aye.
Aye. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis votes aye. Don Tamaki? Don Tamaki votes aye. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp?
Aye.
Aye. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Madam Chair, on the motion, there are 9 members present and voting and 9 aye votes, 0 nay votes, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. There are 9 aye votes and 0 nay votes. The ayes have it and the motion carries. So we will adopt these draft findings as preliminary findings with the ability to amend the findings as we collect more information. So now it's 3:55 and we'll return to what was on our, yes,
Point of order,
parliamentary.
Madam Chair, we have to go back to item number, I believe it was 14, that we did not
Yes.
complete. Thank you.
Thanks. You know. So we have to go back to agenda item 14, which is the agenda for October hearing. So again, I'm going to ask the staff to put on the screen the meeting materials related to this agenda item. And in full transparency, this is, I didn't put this on the agenda, on the agenda for October, for September. I wanted there to be a discussion and overview of task force powers, including our subpoena power. And it was taken out of the agenda, and this was placed on the agenda. But I think it kind of undermines what we've already decided. And at our last hearing in July, we already decided what the topics would be. In the event that task force members would like to see any of the topics amended, feel free to speak up. But at this point, we can have a discussion about what the potential witnesses should be for the 2 days.
I am actually going to jump in here.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My recollection is that a couple meetings ago, we moved to adopt these topics as a framework, a skeletal framework of topics for each subsequent meeting. But we reserve the right to amend. And I have a proposal to add to the topics for the upcoming meeting. And it's included in the materials. I would ask the DOJ to turn to page 97. On page 97, the first item that I think that we should consider talking about in the next series of meetings is the subpoena power. I talked a little bit to the witnesses about that and their thoughts about how we should be utilizing our subpoena power strategically to get information that will buttress our ultimate recommendation. So I do think that in the next meeting, we should have a plenary session where we have an opportunity to not only talk about the subpoena power and how we may want to strategically use it, but also to get a primer from the DOJ on what that subpoena power entails, because I'm not sure that everyone is completely familiar with how a body like this can exercise its subpoena power. So that was one of my recommendations for the next meeting. I would ask to turn also to page 104. Okay, if you could scroll down to where it says, okay, right here, stop, please. Thank you. there is another, in addition to the subpoena issue, I also think we need to have a substantive discussion in a plenary session on who constitutes the community that will receive reparations. I know Dr. Scott Lewis had introduced this topic a couple of meetings ago. It sort of got tabled, and we need to have a robust and fulsome discussion at this point about who constitutes the community of African Americans that will receive reparations, and what and how do we construe that special consideration for descendants of slaves language within that context. There's been a plethora of public comment on that as well, and I do think it's time for this body to have a fulsome discussion of that so that it can inform our questions to witnesses, and so it's something that we grapple with before we start making recommendations. Those are two plenary items that I think it would be important to discuss. And then there are a few topics that I do think need to be added as far as topical issues to the next two meetings. At this time, what I would ask, before I go into the other topics that are not plenary topics, but more subject matter topics, I would ask whether the task force has any comments about the two plenary topics that I am asking to put on the agenda.
The only comment I have is I agree with you, Member Holder. I think we should definitely discuss both of these two topics as plenary sessions, definitely in October. And for full transparency, I added these two plenary sessions for the September hearing, but they were taken out. So I just want to make it clear that, I'm doing my best to make sure everyone's, suggestions and recommendations are heard. And, I wanted us to have this robust conversation about eligibility for this hearing. Also wanted to have a discussion around the other topic that you mentioned again, but they were taken out. So, we need to discuss it sooner rather than later. So I agree with you.
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of our task force. I believe I mentioned some time ago we should consider adding to the list of items to be agendized the restoration of historical sites and institutions that have been destroyed in this state, vis-a-vis Allensworth and historical markers for the meeting of 1858, First AME Zion Church, where they assembled before they left San Francisco, go to British Columbia. There may be other areas. We did have a long discussion about the AME Church down south. I think we should make that a prominent matter to be considered. But we don't get rid of the things that are meaning, that speak to unity and opportunity in this nation. We've been talking about some of these memorials to Confederate folks and evil folk, but we're talking about basic institutions that represented our attempts to establish self-determination. And Allensworth was one, established by Colonel Allen Allensworth from Kentucky. That's it.
And if I can jump back in here, Assembly Member Joan Sawyer.
I don't have a problem with discussion on any of these items. My concern is, and you can look at the time now, it's 4:04. I don't want to rush through anything that Dr. Brown wants to talk about, or you want to talk about descendants of slaves, or even our subpoena power. I just want to make sure, one, we're fully briefed on all that's entailed with this. It would be a shame that we talk about something now and then get some information down the line where we have to make decisions about this, and ultimately we'll make decisions maybe 6 months, a year from now, and we get new information that totally contradicts what information we got right now because we went too fast, or which would be worse, we didn't give it the merit that it needs on each of those. Sometimes it may take an hour or more to go through this. This is not something we should just quickly go through and get some haphazard information. Let's make sure not only that we get all the documentation information that's out there, but most important, I think it would be good for all of us here on this committee to be fully versed on each of these topics. Even now, we were looking at some document now that we just got. I think these topics are so important that we shouldn't rush through them. Yeah, we can go ahead and do that, but I'm just concerned that we don't give it the honor each of those deserve to be able to talk through them. And so I would take that in consideration. And also, we in our efforts, for example, to make sure we had input, we put it at the front end instead of the back end, which was kind of, penny wise, pound foolish. Because on the back end, you could go, or we could allow comments to go on and not structure it just for an hour. But now we've kind of hemmed folk into just 1 hour. So I just want us to think through all the permutations that are involved in this, so that I want to make sure we value every comment that everybody made, and we make sure we give it enough time and enough study and consideration. We get enough experts in here to get us up to speed.
Madam Chair, my comments were about future possible putting on agendizing. I'm not talking about right now.
No, I didn't mean you, Dr. Brown. I meant we're trying to put some other stuff. You're fine. I just want to make sure when your item comes up that we give it the full attention, and we don't give you 10 minutes or 15 minutes, that we actually go into the subjects you want, and we give it its full respect and time. That's what I said.
Okay, thank you very well.
Yeah, and Assembly Member, that's exactly what we're talking about. We are, with this process, we're just trying to figure out what is going to go on our future agendas. And we do want to have an opportunity to discuss each of these matters and bring witnesses on to discuss these matters. But the DOJ needs us to do this preliminary process to decide what is actually going to go on these future agendas, so that they can start preparing and collating witnesses. So that's what this is about.
Okay, and I just want to make sure they're able to, not get them off the hook. Let me say that clear. I'm not going to get them off the hook from not doing their jobs to expedite or do whatever it can to meet our requirements. but I also want to make sure it is doable with all the other stuff we're asking them to do.
More on Tamaki. Can I make a comment?
Yes. Tamaki, you're right.
Yeah, I have a similar logistical question. And again, I think the points that have been raised are good ones. My question is more of a technical one, in that, for example, in October 12, I see that Richard Rothstein might be a witness or a member of the Bruce family, and so on. And there are other witnesses that are being scheduled. So if we rejigger the agenda to deal with these, I'll call them threshold questions that Lisa is raising, does that then postpone the testimony of some of the witnesses? Is there a logistical problem of coordinating, busy people, professors, for example, who would testify? Does that throw the schedule off?
Is staff prepared to answer Member Tamaki's question on that point?
Yes, Madam Chair, this is Sarah Belton. I can respond.
Thank you. You're recognized.
This is a template agenda of what an October meeting could look like. No witnesses have been confirmed with times at this point. So to use an analogy, these are puzzle pieces that we could move. We were simply trying to illustrate that even with the ability to move puzzle pieces, you have a very packed number of topics and things to cover in 2 days. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Member Tamaki, did you have a follow-up question or?
No, that answered my question, that we have some flexibility here to, change up the agenda. So my question is answered.
Okay, thank you.
So I think at this point, it really is just a procedural issue. How do we proceed to actually amend the agenda and incorporate some of these items that Dr. Brown and myself have mentioned? Whether perhaps we could move, I don't know if we have to a formal motion to put in these preliminary items that I recommended we talk about, the subpoenas and the community of interest, or whether I can work with the DOJ, or whether we can have a subcommittee of 2 work with the DOJ to refine the next agenda.
Would anyone like to entertain a motion related to this agenda item?
Well, it's Dawn. I mean, I would move that Lisa Holder be authorized to work with the DOJ to incorporate the proposed changes, assuming that that's the will of the task force. And so I think somebody is going to have to sort of time things out, kind of estimate how long the discussion will be, and then come up with a new iteration of the agenda. And I think maybe the most efficient way to do this is to authorize a task force member to do that. We did that in connection with the community engagement plan for Lisa. Cheryl Grills was authorized to do that, and that worked well. So I would throw that out as a suggestion, and if it's worthy, then a motion.
I will say on June 1, Vice Chair Brown and myself were elected as vice chairperson and chairperson. And if you look back at the slides, we were elected to collaborate with the DOJ to finalize agenda materials. So in June 1, the task force authorized Vice Chair Brown and myself to do this work, but I agree that if we want to, change it around, amend it, or create a subcommittee, that is appropriate as well.
And I would agree with Member Tamaki's recommendation that Member Holder work with the DOJ to make amendments.
You want to make that into a form of a motion, Member Grills?
Sure. I move that Member Lisa Holder be authorized to work with the DOJ staff to make amendments to what will be the final agenda for our October meeting.
Oh, it has been moved by Member Grills that Lisa Holder work with the DOJ to implement amendments to the agenda for the October hearing. Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded that Lisa Holder will be authorized by the task force to work with the DOJ to finalize the amendments for the October hearing. Is there any discussion on this matter?
Madam Chair, I do have a question for clarification. This motion would authorize a Member Holder on top of the duties already set out by the chair and vice chair, correct?
That's what I would like clarity on as well. Where does that leave if we do authorize this to occur? Where does that leave Vice Chair Brown and myself and the duties that we've already been authorized to do by the task force?
My understanding of the duties that were authorized by the task force when you were elected was to act, but it wasn't exclusive. So if the body chooses to either expand that to have someone, and I think from what I understand from hearing this is because those recommendations were of Member Holder. And so she can best, demonstrate to the DOJ where it fits. I mean, it's preliminary. So is that going to mean that it's going to be, at what point and all of that? So with regard to the intricacies, she would be best, based on what I'm hearing, to work with them. That doesn't mean that Chairman Moore or Vice Chair Brown are excluded from, providing information or talking with DOJ, because they are, they are the heads of the task force and can consistently, speak with them, communicate with them as you are authorized to do. But the task force is taking an additional step so that they can, do what needs to happen. Otherwise, the entire, based on this recommendation, based on this article, the entire task force would have to sit and decide, how you're going to do that, because that's what the agenda item is.
Yeah,
so respectfully, I disagree. Member Monica is.
Okay, yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure we've already given authorization. I agree with the Member Holders' suggestions, actually. I very much agree with them. I just want to make sure that we're being, not retracting what we've done in the past. That's all. It's my understanding is the chair and vice chair's primary role is to, authorize kind of what's on that agenda for a body like ours to be able to discuss. And so I just want to make sure that we are in order and that this is a supplement, and I'm in complete agreement with that.
Thank you. And to be quite clear and for transparency, right? Vice Chair Brown and myself, we were working on the agenda for September. The agenda, and in working on the agenda, we were looking through suggestions for the agenda from all task force members. 2 of those suggestions were from Lisa Holder, and that included a discussion on the task force subpoena power and on the other topic. We included those agenda items on the September hearing. They were taken out by DOJ staff. We would have had a discussion about the subpoena power during these 2 days, we would have had a discussion about the other topic related to eligibility and who's included, right, during these 2 days. You know, because as vice chair and as chair, we were doing our duties for over a month to make sure that all task force suggestions were included, but they were taken out by the DOJ, and now we are here, right? That is an issue for me. I'm being very clear and transparent about that. Vice Chair Brown and myself, we were elected to collaborate with the DOJ to do this work. We haven't been wholly respected by the DOJ with our duties, and now we're here. So to be quite honest, I'm even asking if we could even have a closed session between now and the notice period for the next October hearing, so that as a task force, we can talk candidly about how do we all get on the same page to make sure that this task force runs in the way that it should. So that's something that I'm also putting on the table. In light of the many public comments that we've received between these past 2 days, there has to be some type of conversation about how do we all get on board with each other. I also would like to recognize Vice Chair Brown at this moment if you have any comments about.
Madam Chair, members of the task force, I think you was adequately my sentiment. This matter should be a partnership, and there be no hierarchical treatment. We are a task force that was created to do a job. And we should not, I feel, be excluded or disenfranchised in exercising our legal authority. So that if there is some reason that the staff feels certain things shouldn't be done, just say it. Talk to us. But I think it's a bit much for arbitrary decisions to be made without any discussion. So I hope that the other task force members feel the same and that they would be candid and express their position on it, this matter.
Point of clarification, Madam Chair. I just want to make sure that folks understand my intention was not to disenfranchise or exclude the chair and vice chair. It was with respect to the fact that Member Holder made specific recommendations and has a particular understanding about what is intended in those recommendations and whom would be best served to address those topics. That was the reason that I agreed with this idea of her being given the authority to work with the DOJ on this. I also procedurally didn't assume that if she's tasked with that no task force member couldn't still weigh in and send information to either Attorney Holder or to the staff with recommendations or thoughts about the topics for the October meeting, inclusive of the chair and the vice chair. And then, of course, procedurally, I also assume that before any agenda goes out, I'm vice chair of a county commission. And when I was vice chair or chair, which I've been several times, an agenda never went out, regardless of who was giving input on it, without the chair seeing that agenda.
Well, I'm glad, Member Grills, that you brought that up because that was not the case for this September hearing. In fact, DOJ staff sent Vice Chair Brown and myself an agenda on Friday, this last Friday, which was different than the agenda that was sent out to members of the public and other task force members on Monday. So that is not the case. That is not what is happening during this process. So this is part and parcel why I think there needs to be a closed session so that everyone is on the same page about our duties and responsibilities and our roles.
Madam Chair, you cannot hold a closed session under the Bagley-Keene Act. So that you can't do. There's no authorization for a closed session. It specifically identifies under what circumstances a closed session can be held, and this is not one. This has to be an open meeting, and you can set it for an agenda item and go from that point, but you cannot hold a closed session. I don't have before me readily available the minutes to which you refer. I think maybe one of the staff can better respond to that. But when Dr. Grills indicated that, seconded the motion, it's a procedural, it was really to expedite what now, I mean, you could have just continued with this during this meeting, but that was basically to help expedite the program. But if you have questions regarding procedure, then I think you need to address that to DOJ and ask that be on an agenda so that you can have it vetted openly at the meeting.
Well, under the Bagley-Keene Act, there are options for a closed section, particularly like section 1126A and 1126C3, the personnel exception and the deliberations exception.
This is not
at first you said
this. Okay. No, I said that there are specific provisions for closed session for state, for state bodies. This is a state body. So you have to follow specifically what is authorized under the Bagley-Keene Act that allows for a closed session. And what I am saying, this is not a personnel matter. So it doesn't meet that qualification.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Vice Chair Brown.
We got at this point of needing to have this discussion because there were some things that were done by the staff. And we have nothing to hide. We can say it before the world.
Please do.
From the mountaintop. And the basic issue is, if we as a task force have established a basic structure that is within the law of chair and vice chair and members of this task force, we should respect the protocol that has been established, in my estimation. And it should never be that any staff would make changes and decisions without respecting the leadership and saying why they made the change. And if there are justifiable reasons, we're civil and decent enough to hear it, but we ought to iron things out together and not be operating in silos. So that's the thing that this task force has the moral obligation to make very clear to the governor, to the assembly, and all those legislative partners. As Aretha Franklin said, RESPECT. And we need to respect each other and definitely respect protocol. That's what the issue is about. And when it comes to placing things on the agenda, if we talk with each other as chair and vice chair, why do we need to reinvent the wheel on matters?
So,
Hello?
Ms. Moore, you're on mute.
You're
Right. Thank you. I just wanted to quickly clarify, the ideas around the topics around the subpoena power and the topic around eligibility, that didn't only come from Member Holder. Those are also ideas that I had in mind as well. Again, we both wanted to discuss these topics for this 2-day hearing, and they were taken out by the DOJ. So I just wanted to make that clear that it didn't only come from Member Holder. And so still at this time, I'm struggling with, in full transparency, how are we going to develop the agenda, including confirming witnesses for this October hearing and December, but we can focus on October.
Chair Moore, can I be heard?
Yes.
Just a couple things. One is, it is possible that we could, I know there's a motion on the floor, so I'm not putting one on the floor. But there's possible that we could potentially move to add those things to the October agenda and give, if there are things that need to be taken off, if we have to make that decision today, I'd rather not, but if we have to, then I'm okay with that as well. I'm just putting that out there. The other thing is that I think as a task force, on the subject that we are studying, I think it's very important that we, based on the restrictions of us not being able to talk to each other, very important for me to show support for our chair and vice chair to staff, and make that very clear, that I don't know what has happened, but I know that in the order of things and the way that we have voted as a body, that, if there are things that are coming before us as a body that haven't gone through our chair and vice chair that we've given that authority to, then that's a problem for all of us. And what I don't want to do is get stuck in the procedure. This is what the system does. We get stuck in the procedure, we don't get to the substance, and then we fall in the same trap. We're supposed to be kind of rising above that, even the proposals that we move forward and everything that we do. So I just don't, I don't want to get stuck in that. I also don't want anything to be personal, right? Because we can't, really talk to each other. We're not around each other. So this is nothing against anyone that has supported a motion, put a motion on the floor. It's not about that for me. It's just, though, I see larger picture procedure getting in the way of the substance. I think most of us probably agree that at the very least we want to see the subpoena power and we want to discuss eligibility on the next agenda. So,
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Yes, and the parliamentarian, we need some help here. We need to clear up something. Is it a fact that we are gagged and we can't talk to each other? I
That
thought
is correct. That is correct. You cannot, no more than two of you can talk together on a topic outside of the meeting.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
So it needs to be made clear because people getting confused. We can talk to each other, but you
outside of the, yes, outside. I'm sorry, Dr. Brown.
We cannot have a group that would represent a committee in violating the transparency law. That's all. I can talk to any individuals I want to talk to, but I can't have no official meeting to do anything.
I would defer to DOJ with regard to Bagley-Keene. Keep in mind that what you've been told is that when 3 or more of you speak or meet, and it could be at a social gathering, you still cannot discuss the business that's before this body at that meeting.
We're not talking about 3 or more, Madam, Ms. Johnson.
No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. 2 people can meet.
All right, but the previous speakers have been saying we can't talk to each other and we need to get rid of that boogeyman.
it's a contextual thing. I think I was clear. I hope I was clear in terms of what you can do, but perhaps you might want to add that to a primer from DOJ and ask them to clarify for you what it is under Bagley-Keene you can and cannot do, so that you are clear on that, because that's very important that you understand. And I agree with you, Dr. Brown. If there's an inconsistent interpretation, that's not helping you. But what you do want to do is know what the rule is so that you can, apply it in all of your dealing. But in this instance, this is a matter for your task force. And as I heard, someone made a motion to do X. That is the matter before you. So you can carry that out, and like any other motion, vote it up or down, and then move from there. And if you want to withdraw the motion, that's another option. And if you want to withdraw it and authorize adding those 2 items on the agenda as it is, to amend it in that way, then you can do that. So those are 2 options that you have available with respect to where you stand right now. I hope that helps.
No, that helps a lot. I would suggest that someone go ahead and perhaps make the motion to withdraw the previous motion and to just go ahead and put the 2 items on the next agenda.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Ms. Parliamentarian Johnson, you are recognized.
Yes, then she is moving to just add those 2 items, the preliminary items that you mentioned earlier, to the agenda.
Okay, there is a motion. So as member Holder is putting in the motion?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there is a motion from member Holder to withdraw the previous motion. Is there a second? Because I want to take it in 2 parts.
She just wants to, the second wants to withdraw her second. I mean, that's what's before you now. So have the seconder, whoever seconded the motion, withdraw the second.
Yes. Is there a second?
You have to withdraw the second.
Just, they want to withdraw the second, not make a second. She wants to withdraw her motion that she needs, or whoever made the motion to meet.
Right.
Okay. So the person.
Okay,
yeah.
I was making. Okay, so it's member Grills. Go ahead.
So I withdraw my motion.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, I was going to say the person who made the motion has to withdraw it. So thank you, member Grills. So at this time, will anyone like to entertain a motion related to this agenda item?
What?
Trying to make this as formalized as possible. So there needs to be another motion to include the 2 topics into the agenda.
All right, I will make a motion to include on the next meeting agenda 2 items. The first item being a primer and discussion on the task force's subpoena power. Second item being a discussion on the community of eligibility for reparation.
Thank you. There is a motion and it has been moved by member Holder to add these 2 items to the agenda for October. 1, a discussion on the overview of subpoena power for the task force, and 2, a discussion on the community of eligibility. Is there a second?
I will second.
It has been properly moved and seconded that we add these following agenda items to the October hearing. 1, a topic on subpoena power, and 2, a topic surrounding a community of eligibility. Is there any discussion on this matter?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Steve Bradford. I really need clarity on the fact that the DOJ has veto power on our agenda. I mean, I'm really troubled by that, and that's where we really need to be clear on going forward.
Yeah.
Either we're the body who's empowered to move this task force forward and set our own agenda to address what AB3121 said we should do, or it's the DOJ. And I don't think that's what the bill stated. So I just want to know going forward, we shouldn't have to go through these, maneuvers to put something back on agenda that we originally agendized for a meeting. And can we get clarity from that, from be it Ms. Johnson or Ms. Belton, that who we have the authority to set our own agenda? I guess not. I guess you call for the vote, but if they want to answer that afterwards, I really like answers to that.
Okay, we'll return to that. Thank you, Member Bradford. So it has been properly moved and seconded that we'll add, as I said, the 2 agenda items to the discussion. Is there to the agenda? Is there any further discussion on this matter? Excuse me.
Call for the question, Madam Chair.
Don't do that.
Okay, so I will now turn to Parliamentarian Johnson, who will then turn to Ms. Belton, so that we can take the roll call vote.
Yes, Madam Chair. Attorney Belton, would you please call for the vote on the call of the question?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will vote by member, and please indicate your vote by aye, nay, or abstain. Chair Moore, your vote, please. Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Dr. Brown?
Yes. Yes.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown votes yes. Senator Stephen Bradford?
Aye.
Aye. Senator Stephen Bradford votes aye. Dr. Cheryl Grills?
Aye.
Aye. Dr. Cheryl Grills votes aye. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer?
Aye.
Aye. Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer votes aye. Lisa Holder?
Aye.
Aye. Lisa Holder votes aye. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis?
Aye.
Aye. Dr. Javon Scott Lewis votes aye. Don Tamaki?
Aye.
Don Tamaki votes aye. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp?
Aye.
Aye. Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Madam Chair, on the motion, there are 9 members present and voting. There are 9 aye votes, 0 nay votes, and 0 abstentions.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. There were 9 aye votes and 0 nay votes. The ayes have it, and so the motion carries. Now, if we could return to Member Bradford. Ms. Belton, are you prepared to answer his question at this time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Bradford, I would simply say that the Department of Justice is carrying out the directives of the task force as authorized by the task force as a body of 9 members, and that our staff has worked pretty diligently to be able to deliver on the many directives of the task force members, as I think you've seen here on the 2-day meeting yesterday and today. Thank you.
But you didn't ask the question on whether you have veto power on our items or not. No one's questioned the of the work that you've done in carrying out the task, but we had 2 items specifically on this agenda for this meeting that were removed. So we want to know who has the authority to set the agenda, either it's the task force or it's DOJ.
I believe, thank you, Senator Bradford. I believe in our initial presentation in June, we specifically said we would collaborate with the chair and the vice chair to set the agenda. We have certainly done that, and we will continue to do so.
And respectfully, this is why, I'm asking clarity on a closed session under the personnel exception, because under the personnel exception, we can have a closed session to evaluate the performance of staff or a particular staff member.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Yeah. the question was not answered. Why was it changed? Was there a miscommunication, misstep on their part, or what? And we need the blessed assurance that this will not happen again, and that we're going to work together. But it didn't happen in this previous situation. And that's the reason why the question was raised by my brother. So it's unfortunate we have to make the assumption that the message has been gotten over. So I think we should move on, Madam Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Vice Chair Brown.
May I ask a question, Chair Moore?
Yes, Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Yeah, without, again, further prolonging this discussion, I'm just wondering if it's an issue of authority in terms of the Attorney General's office being able to respond and answer these questions. I mean, some of them may well be. For example, the Saturday meetings may be beyond the authority that Ms. Belton can provide. Maybe we need to be talking to someone higher up in the Attorney General's office to answer these questions. I think they're totally legitimate and they're the right questions to ask. But I want to make sure we're talking to the right people too. And
Brother Don.
Yes.
Madam Chair, excuse me. Brother Don, I can answer that question.
Yes, please.
Attempts have been made to speak to the Attorney General and the higher ups. And evasive posture. I say no more.
To be specific, we've had a meeting with Michael Newman, who is a higher up and evasive, and agreed with staff in taking out agenda items that task force members wanted included. And so we are working on meeting with more higher ups, right? So we're working on meeting with the chief of staff of Bonta's office and Bonta himself and Secretary Weber to address these issues.
Well, this is Steve Bradford. I'm going to place a personal call into Attorney General Bonta and get clarity on this issue, because it makes no sense, really. No disrespect to staff, but I've served on plenty of boards, and I've never known where staff has veto power over either elected or appointed board and setting that agenda.
Thank you. We would appreciate your help on this matter. So, we're over time, and we haven't gotten to a discussion on potential witnesses. And I before we close, I want to do my due diligence. And I wanted to ask, of the names that are listed on the tentative agenda for witnesses, I wanted to seek clarity if that's proper. If any of these names, or which names came from task force members, and which names came from staff. It's something that I would want clarity on, but we have run out of time. Member Tamaki, you are recognized.
So for this is, I think maybe others people have suggested these names. They're certainly in the written materials that have been provided. But with respect to housing, Richard Rothstein and Helen Kang. Rothstein has done this groundbreaking study on the impact of redlining and segregation and redevelopment. And Helen Kang did a law review study focusing on the Bayview Hunters Point and the Fillmore. So I thought those were particularly illustrative of the issues that, happen throughout California. And they are leading authorities, so I did suggest those two.
Great, thank you so much, Member Tamaki, for that information. Would any other task force member like to speak on any witness suggestions for our next hearing before we conclude?
Well, this is Bradford again. As the author of SB 796 that will return the property to the Bruce's family, who have you identified? Because I didn't see a name associated with this. And the name I would like to see is Anthony Bruce, because he's the only direct descendant. He's the great-great-grandson of Willa and Charles Bruce. And his voice has pretty much been, I won't say silent, but not engaged as much in what has happened in California. He's gotten a lot of media attention as of late, but I would just really love to hear from him and what this means to him directly. And I know we've had Chief Yellowfeather, Dwayne Shepard, and Kavon Ward, who's been a tremendous champion on this, but I would just like to hear from the direct descendant of the Bruce family, the great-grandson, Anthony Bruce. So that's my thoughts as it relates to Bruce Beach. And hopefully we'll have a signature from the governor in the next week.
Thank you, Member Bradford, for that witness recommendation. Member Scott Lewis, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. I haven't been consulted on any of the potential witnesses, but when it comes to the topic of environmental racism, I would at least like to be consulted by the DOJ on possible witnesses, given my position as chair of the Department of Geography, which has a specialism in that area. The proposed names, while leaders in some of the thinking around environmental racism, I could think of alternatives who have a more direct experience with the history of the state of California and African American communities in the state. So I would like to be consulted, and perhaps we can have a conversation around that via email through the normal consultative process.
Great, thank you so much for that, Member Scott Lewis. Any other members of the task force, before we conclude, would like to make their witness recommendations and suggestions known at this time for our public hearing? I just have a few names. Oh, I have a few names. I would like to endorse some of the names that are already on the agenda, namely Marissa Bedrin, who is a law professor at UC Irvine. Also Dorothy Brown, who is a tax law professor. I'm suggesting Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote the case for reparations, which is related to housing discrimination. I'm also suggesting James Anderson, who wrote a book about education for Blacks in the South. We have some interesting information to impart. Also potentially Bobby Seale, who's a founder and chairman of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and Elaine Brown, and someone from the Black Farmers Movement and Union, because there's a lot of developments on that going on right now. Okay. I would like to, if there's not any other questions or comments from members of the task force at this time, I would like to conclude the meeting and thank you all for your dedication and commitment. That includes staff and members of the public. At this time, I would like to adjourn the meeting. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.